All right, so today we're going to talk in a little bit about virtualization with regards to your disaster recovery plan. The objective here is to try and understand the technical components of virtualization and how that might help you with your DR planning process or actually the technical implementation of a DR plan. So let's get right into it. Virtualization itself is a technology, and what it's doing is it is converting where you'd normally run a physical operating system on a single physical server. Um, Instead, what you do is you are able to run multiple instances of a virtual server on one piece of physical equipment. And the reason why this works is basically that most servers don't do a lot most of the time. And so you have unused cycles of CPU, or the central processing unit, and you have unused hard drive space. So if you look at a typical Windows domain controller, for example, all it's really supposed to be doing is maintaining the Active Directory database, responding to LDAP queries and authentication requests, and issuing tokens. Now, in the morning, when everybody comes into the office, it's probably busy because everybody's being authenticated by it. But throughout the day, it's really not doing all that much. So you have all this unused CPU time. And if you look at most Windows servers, they on average use about 10% of the CPU that's available to them. And in fact, that keeps going down because CPU and hard drive both are getting much larger, in fact, exponentially larger according to Moore's law. So, a year and a half from now, the typical server that you might buy probably has easily, twice as much capacity as a server you would buy today. And domain controller, in the Windows environment, even with Windows 2000 Server 8 or, the next iteration, is not going to require that much more CPU in order to authenticate somebody. The basic functionality of that domain controller is not going to change very much. So for a lot of organizations that have, a domain controller, a file server, maybe they have an Exchange server and a SQL server and a few other things that are running in the background for supporting services. If you have 5 or 6 physical servers, you probably only need, half of the CPU or maybe a third of the CPU that you actually have available to you. So what virtualization does is it takes the operating system and it makes it hardware independent. It actually is hosted on a physical server, but the operating system itself is stored within a file. So the C drive of your server is, instead of the 50 or 75,000 files that make up Windows, instead what you have is a single file that's stored on a hard disk somewhere. And the host machine simply uses that file in order to give you access to a virtual copy of the operating system. And the value of that is that you could have on one physical host machine, you could have 4 or 5 or 10 or maybe 20 virtual machines that are running all independently. They all look like the same physical machine that you have today in your physical shop, and you can access them just like you would any other Windows file share. They do the same services. They're otherwise the same. The only difference is that you don't need to have 5 or 10 or 20 physical pieces of equipment, each with an individual operating system on it. Now, within the context of disaster recovery, the technology of virtualization gives you the flexibility to build a clone or an exact duplicate of your production systems. So, for example, if you have a Windows 2003 server that's running a database that supports your electronic medical record system, you have the capacity to migrate that to a virtual platform. And maybe you also need an interface server, or you have a practice management system, or you have a terminal server, let's say, for people to access the client side of the application. Or you have some other infrastructure, like a file server, just simply to store images that you've scanned in and indexed into your medical record system. or you just have general files, to operate your business, or you have a financial package. Well, you might have 5 or 6 or 7 servers in your closet or in your server room, and you could run all of those potentially on 1 or 2 host machines if it's sufficiently powerful enough. And you can also replicate. So relatively inexpensively, you could implement a solution where a copy of that server is replicated off-site somewhere else. Maybe if you have 2 locations that you operate from, you could put a less powerful host machine at the other site, at your disaster recovery site, and use the technology that's available to you to replicate data um, really at the block level. So a compressed version of just changes to your production environment. You can replicate that on a regular schedule. So you could have, in the event of an emergency, you'd have this other system available to you that's within a few hours potentially of your production environment's data. Turn that thing up in your other site, and you'd be able to operate from that as if you hadn't lost your production system, or if you did, that you've lost a couple hours or a few hours worth of work, which you probably can recreate if necessary, from your production environment. Now, there's a lot of technology out there today for virtualization. VMware is still probably the industry leader, and in fact, that's where I've had a technical experience. But you could also use Microsoft's virtualization platform, which is built into their latest operating system. There are plenty of places that operate that in production or potentially just for your disaster recovery system. And there are other competitors out there. I know I've looked at Virtual Iron a few years ago, which is a competitor to VMware. There are other systems that, or other system makers that are developing virtualization platforms. They're probably a little bit further behind VMware. But the technology is out there, and so you have the capability to really, replicate, using that virtualization system.